Indy 500 will be run with some fans despite nothing having changed since last time. That is the headline and bold-faced lie which comes from Jalopnik. And if you don't know what Jalopnik is, once upon a time it was a car blog that was pretty much must-read in the early 2010s. But around the last 5 or 6 years or so, Jalopnik has become essentially a laughingstock in the industry, particularly for articles such as this one. Now, we're going to lay some ground rules here. Number one, I will not be mentioning the author by name. And that's two simple facts. The first one is that, first of all, I want to attack the point and not the person. I think that's incredibly important to do in debates, otherwise you lose your credibility. And the second point is that I'm not trying to come out here and make somebody famous for writing rage bait, inaccurate articles. Again, we're attacking the point here, and we're not trying to make somebody famous. And you may be saying, but David, by making a video about this, aren't you drawing attention to it, or perhaps more attention than it otherwise would have gotten? And to that I will say I ignored quite a few articles last year that were very similar to this one, and ultimately it didn't change the result, did it? I would rather go down swinging and attack misinformation rather than just sit by and hope it doesn't affect anything. So this lying headline isn't just for rage bait, it's actually the thesis of the article. So let's read. It's been 6 months since the 2020 Indianapolis 500, and for all practical purposes, nothing has changed, except the fact that 5 times as many people are dead from having contracted coronavirus since then. Needless to say, this is a lie by omission. Since August, a vaccine has been developed, it's been safety tested, and it's begun distribution. And according to the NPR, nearly 70 million vaccines have been administered. That's 75% of the initial doses, accounting for over 13% of the U.S. population. With 90 days still to go until the Indianapolis 500, it's not only reasonable, but right to assume that those numbers are not just suddenly going to be frozen from where they are in February. They're likely going to be significantly higher by the time we get to May. And likely there will also be availability of vaccines to those in not high-risk groups. And remember, with the way the United States distribution of the vaccine is, the people in the higher risk groups are the ones that are getting access to the vaccine first. So when we're talking about that 13%, the vast majority of those people are in that high risk group, that 5 to 7% that the COVID-19 coronavirus is most deadly to. And quite frankly, just based on that alone, I'm very confused how anyone in their right mind can claim that absolutely nothing has changed between August and the end of February. Now let's take a look at some case numbers from the CDC. As you can see, cases are falling dramatically from the peak in the wintertime. And as the weather begins to warm up and vaccinations increase, that trend will only improve. But let's take it a step further, because this article makes this bold claim. So if conditions in last August were so bad that Indy couldn't go with spectators, according to local health officials, with just over 100,000 deaths, why is 2021 any different with a projection of over 600,000 dead? Well, let's bring our CDC chart back up. Here's where the original 2020 Indy 500 date was in May. Here's where the rescheduled date was, and of course we know it was run without fans. Here's where the Daytona 500 was run with fans. And here's the NFL season, where roughly half of the teams hosted fans at least one home game this year. Aha, you may say. This must be it. The fact that the NFL teams allowed fans in the stands must have caused that huge spike we saw in the winter, despite, of course, the fact that just in the racing world alone, IMSA, NASCAR, and IndyCar, for all but 2 races, were hosting fans at most of their events without a sizable spike in coronavirus cases. Well, now we have that observation backed by a scientific study. It was produced by MedRx, which is partially owned by Yale University, which states that NFL teams that had fans in the stands for games did not increase the spread of COVID-19. Let's read. The effect of in-person attendance at NFL and NCAA games on community COVID-19 spread is not significant, as it did not surpass 5 new daily cases of COVID-19 per 100,000 residents on average. Our study suggests that NFL and NCAA football games hosted with limited in-person attendance do not cause a significant increase in local COVID-19 cases. If you're interested in reading the full study, the link will be in the description. And remember, most NFL stadiums are indoors. That means that, say, the Dallas Cowboys, which hosted up to 25% of its seating capacity, would host people as many as 22,000 people. And that's indoors and in a big city center area with a lot more people than just the 22,000 that were traveling into town. Remember, this wasn't just limited to you can only buy a ticket if you're in the Dallas area. Home fans, away fans, any fan that wanted a ticket to an NFL game pretty much could get it. People were traveling to these events, and it still wasn't affecting the numbers. And for those keeping score, that's 25% indoors with no vaccine and cases rising rapidly. And I think it's important to note as well that Roger Penske, when he proposed his 25% capacity for the Indy 500 in August of 2020, his 100-page report was approved by the Indiana Health Department. Now let's remind ourselves just how massive the Indianapolis Motor Speedway facility is, especially compared to stick and ball stadiums.
Just how big is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway? Well, within the 2.5-mile racetrack is an infield that measures 320 acres, or enough space to accommodate not just one or two, but all 26 Major League Baseball parks.
Now, if we go back to the CDC chart and take a look where the 2020 Indianapolis 500 took place, cases were at the time declining. If this study is to be believed, and there's no real reason to doubt it, had the Indianapolis 500 run with fans at the planned 25%, it very likely would not have affected case numbers one way or the other, just like the NFL games. The numbers rose, as we've been told by scientists since the pandemic began, because human beings are simply more susceptible to disease in the winter. So not only do we have this study, we have rapidly declining case numbers, and we also, of course, now have a vaccine which is becoming widely distributed within the United States. As far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no reason that the Indianapolis 500 cannot host fans this year. But I think our author of this piece wasn't planning on going to the Indy 500 under any circumstances. Let's read the final line of this article because I think it really paints a clear picture. The only way I'd be interested in attending the Indy 500 this year as a spectator would be if my ticket came with a guaranteed jump up the vaccination line. Now here's my personal interpretation of this article and the perspective it's been written from. I think this is a person who has never so much as stepped foot in the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, again, under any circumstance, good or bad. And I suspect this person will not do that at any time in the future, regardless of the pandemic. This was written from a disingenuous place, and it comes off exactly like that. And that brings up a much bigger issue. And that is, what disingenuous place is that exactly? Why the Indy 500? I've asked myself that quite a bit over the last few months because it seems like the Indy 500, perhaps more than any other sporting event in the world, and that includes, say, the Super Bowl, or even if you're looking at, say, racing events, the Daytona 500, both of those were able to run with fans and didn't have hit piece articles coming out about them 4 months before the race even begins. And it just makes me scratch my head. Why is that? And let's be honest with ourselves. Even without the study I showed you earlier, what really makes the Indy 500 different than, say, any of the other mass gatherings we've seen throughout this country in the last 10 months? Someone brought this idea up to me on Twitter, and it's an interesting one. that the Indianapolis 500 is a big enough event to make an example of, but it's also a weak enough event that you can actually take it down with some effort. And I think there's certainly at least an element to that. I mean, I could see, you could make the argument that an American institution run on a Memorial Day weekend, yeah, I think there's some people who would take great pleasure in finding a way to take that event down, or at least knock it down a peg. I think theoretically you could see an article with that motivation behind it. And believe me, this article will not be the last one before we get to the Indy 500 in May. But I think it's a different motivation. I think what we're really seeing here, and what we have been seeing with the Indy 500, is that Roger Penske, when he made his declaration that the Indy 500 would run with fans or it wouldn't run at all, he challenged a narrative. And that narrative challenging needed to be punished. And it was. The Indy 500, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, eventually had to cave to the pressure. Well, of course, just like blood in the water for sharks, that is going to attract all of the attention once again because the precedent has been set. And once again, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has doubled down on their commitment to fans and having them at the Indianapolis 500 this year. And of course, that cannot go unpunished. You see, the Indy 500 has become a marked event. Data will no longer matter to some. Facts will no longer matter to some. It will just be an ideological battle to make sure the Indy 500, for whatever reason, for some, is shut down forever. In my opinion, we can't let that happen. I hope you've enjoyed this video, or at least learned something from it. I tried to do as much research as possible because I'm aware that this is a very sensitive issue. And, you know, at least for me, I can't say the same for this article. I think it was very important to get things right. It's a sensitive time in this country. It's a sensitive time in this world. There's a lot of people going through a lot of stuff. But at the same time, we have got to get back to normal. We have got to not let things like this ruin our country, ruin our way of life, and ruin our institutions like the Indianapolis 500. We made some sacrifices last year. For better or for worse, there were no fans at the Indy 500 last year. The safe decision ultimately at the end of the day was made. And I think we now have enough data, we have enough facts, we have enough defense against this virus that there's absolutely no reason that the Indy 500 should not run without fans this year. And yeah, that's it. I'm sure there are more articles coming, and you better believe I'm going to respond to them this year. We're not going to let them do it again, that's for sure. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next video.